me introduce James to you. James Poskett is Associate Professor in the History of Science and Technology at the University of Warwick. He completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge and held some research fellowships, 18 research fellowships at Dartmouth College, Cambridge, and he's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. James broadly works on the global history of science, from 1750 to the present day. He has published 2 books. The first book, Materials of the Mind, Phrenology, Race, and the Global History of Science. And this book was awarded in 2020 President's Book Award by the Social Science History Association. The second book, which is How I Met James, his work, is Horizons, A Global History of Science. It's forthcoming in a Turkish translation as well. It will be translated into Turkish. Alongside these books, Poskett James has published academic articles in leading journals. Just like I'm trying to do for the last 2 years, Poskett James aims to bring the history of science to wide an audience as possible. He writes in national newspapers, websites, and magazines, including The Guardian, New Scientists, and Nature. He has also appeared on broadcast media, including for BBC World Service, and Audible. James works closely with museums, creating displays, and acting as a consultant for major exhibitions. He also provides policy recommendations and has submitted evidence to the Science and Technology Committee of the UK Parliament. Welcome, James. So, if you're ready, I'll just fire away with the first question.
Yeah, absolutely. Just briefly to say thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. And before we discuss things a little bit more, I just wanted to say also thank you to the many Turkish historians and historians of the Ottoman world in particular. The book I'm going to talk about is a global history, but it wouldn't have been possible to write that history without the work of historians of different regions. So I wanted to begin by saying that whilst I'm here.
Thank you. So my first question is this. Obviously your book is about global history of science, and I'm just curious. I mean, I have certain ideas having actually read your book, but I just, would like to, for the benefit of the audience, what novelty do you bring to the table? I mean, what's new, James?
So what's new? Maybe it would be useful to answer that question by giving a brief overview of the argument of the book. So the book argues that we cannot understand the development of modern science and its history from around 1500 to the present without a global historical approach. So rather than just looking at individual nations or individual regions or empires, that science, modern science, was fundamentally made through what I call global cultural exchange, through Venetian envoys in the Ottoman lands, through Jesuits in China, through Mexican geneticists travelling to Europe. So we'll talk more about some of the examples later, but this idea of cultural exchange being at the heart of modern science. And when you do that, crucially, you move away from this very traditional Eurocentric vision of the history of science, in which modern science is usually thought of as something that's made by Europeans and in Europe, particularly around the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. So the argument of the book and what's new about it, that idea that science is global, I think, is not itself new, but to bring all this research together and to argue that case with the detail and the evidence over a 500-year period, that's what I think is new about the book, and bringing that to a wider audience as well. Okay.
So, kind of the main
intention is to provide something wider for a wider audience as well as other things, you know, like a kind of a methodological attitude, methodological approach, but you want to make it accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. It's supposed to be, it is a serious work of history that I think makes a serious methodological contribution to how we write the history of science. It's meant for academics as well as something that you can teach with. It's meant for students as an accessible way to read about the history of science without having to go through all the literature I went through to write the book. But it's also meant, as you say, for a very general audience. That's why in various countries I've published it with presses that have a wide appeal, that can market it to a wide audience. Because I think these narratives are as much in the public sphere as they are in the academic sphere about how we got to the modern world, how we made modern science.
Absolutely, I actually think exactly the same. And hopefully we'll have the same conversation in Turkish when your book gets published in Turkey.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the very first thing you mentioned about, you know, the history of science in general, and the scientific revolution in particular is heavily Eurocentricized. But there are quite a number of interpretations which aims to criticize Eurocentric historiography. And the kind of argument that I like about this critique is the concept of epistemic violence. So can you please, for the sake of our audience, can you please define, and do you actually kind of hold to that argument because of the epistemic violence, because of the kind of assumption that the knowledge which is produced in the West is supposed to overshadow any other types of knowledge, any other geographical experience in science, you know, ended up causing this Eurocentric domination.
So yeah, the concept of epistemic violence comes from post-colonial studies, and particularly Spivak's work on Canon Subaltern Speed, which is one of the main mechanisms through which that was explained. And it was originally developed to indicate that obviously colonial violence was a real physical thing. It involved killing people, harming people, occupying land. But also, and I think this is much more widely accepted than it was at the time Spivak was writing, that violence occurs in a similar way, but in the cultural sphere, in the world of language, in the world of knowledge, about what languages you're forced to learn under colonialism, what regimes of knowledge and history you're forced to learn. And a big part of the argument of my book actually is not that this is a happy story of globalization. It's not, it's a small world and everyone's holding hands making science. It's the story of how the modern world of colonialism, of capitalism, of the Cold War, of empire and slavery, how those were the ways in which connections were forged. And there are massive power imbalances there. So in that sense, there's an element of epistemic violence at work in the other forms of knowledge, say the knowledge of indigenous people of the Americas, the Aztecs particularly, the Mexica, or the knowledge of the indigenous people of the Pacific, who had really advanced ways of understanding the stars, how their knowledge has been effaced from the history of science. Interestingly, I think that's more, I was careful to say the history of science, but I think that's a problem more of historians of science than the scientists of the past. So in the 18th century, people like Cook, whilst committing all kinds of actual physical colonial violence and epistemic violence, Captain Cook, who went to the Pacific, the British naval officer, quite happily acknowledged his reliance on Polynesian navigators. So epistemic violence, I think, is a useful way to frame things. I think there's a limit to how useful it is as well, because a lot of my book is about recovering stuff that wasn't in fact completely lost or obliterated under colonialism. It's about the agency of these people, and it shows that actually, quote unquote, Western knowledge was never Western. There was always this cultural exchange, just often it was appropriation. It was borrowing or taking, say, the knowledge of an Aztec physician and representing it in a 16th century Spanish or Latin book of natural history. So I do think there is epistemic violence, like there is physical colonial violence. I think it's actually most prevalent in the case of indigenous knowledge, actually.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah. So in the case of the indigenous people of the Americas, the indigenous people of the Pacific, that's where you see really epistemic violence at its strongest. Actually, in the South Asian context that Spivak talks is thinking of, there is absolutely epistemic violence. Obviously, the introduction of English language, the introduction of English history under British colonialism. But there are many more mechanisms through which elite South Asians in like the 19th century are able to speak back. Not the subaltern that she talks about, obviously, and in fact a lot of this is about elites. So yeah, these are useful concepts.
I understand what you mean by kind of not taking the epistemic violence as an overarching concept too far. I understand that. But I think what you do is to give voice to the kind of cultural and scientific subaltern. Subaltern in the sense that not necessarily geographic, but a metaphorical, kind of thing. So that you do that in your book.
That is what I tried to do. Someone kindly described what I was trying to do as reparative, and that is what I think of it as, in that I think there are lots of different people that have different roles to play in writing the history of science. I'm a white British man at a leading university in the UK, and that comes with certain privileges, but I think those privileges should be used to write back into history the people that were written out by British colonialism.
Fair enough, yes. So then it's time for me to ask about, where you stand in the UK as a, kind of a historian of science and technology, writing a global history of science. Would an effort to emphasize global connections, do you think, hinder the local scientific practice? Because when you actually kind of talk about what's global all the time, and you have a certain word limit, you have certain, kind of conceptual framework when you set it in global perspective. So what happens to the local, minor, not minor in the sense that undermining, but kind of local experiences of science and technology? What do you think?
People ask this a lot about global history. Doesn't it efface the local? My short answer is no, it doesn't. But I'll explain that a little bit. I think certain forms of global history do, and a lot of global history, in fact, the global history that was written at my university, the University of Warwick, initially, was global economic history. And so it was about economic connections over long distances, which tended, I agree, to kind of efface local cultures and also the process of exchange and how that mattered. But the kind of global history I write is global cultural history or global intellectual history, and it's always grounded in a particular place. This isn't an abstract history of scientific ideas. I make it very clear at the start of the book, this is about real people's lived experiences. And the way I write the book is partly to appeal to a general audience, to give you examples of, say, a Mexican geneticist taking blood samples at the Olympic Games, or a Dutch physician travelling in 18th century Japan in a carriage, when we carried like a palanquin. So I really try to bring to life these individual local places. My point is simply that in these instances, the space, the local space, isn't defined just by what is proximate geographically. In fact, particularly for major urban centres, even 500 years ago, somewhere like Istanbul, also somewhere like Paris or Mexico City or Beijing, or even in rural Japan, these places are made through their connections with the rest of the world. So this is partly where the book is more methodological, in that it's about asking us to think about what do we mean by local, and what is the concept of space and scale we're applying.
Yeah.
And the assumption that, okay, I'm doing local history means I must be doing a history which is demarcated by the geography of a map,
No.
looking down on Edinburgh or looking down on Britain. That, I think, is the big methodological error of a lot of history, and that's what my global historical approach tries to undo. It says, focus on a place as remote as you like, but look for the connections that are connecting that place and transforming that place, and the people and the ideas in that place.
True. And there's another methodology which, our colleagues, are aware of, familiar with. You can actually do global history by doing in a micro, perspective. Seb Falk's book. Yeah. Seb did it in a kind of a micro manner, but touching to kind of cultural exchange and global connection. So you can do it like that as culture.
Yeah, I never used the term global microhistory, and it started to be used a lot more now.
It's very
It's kind of fashionable. I slightly resent that because I sort of feel like I was doing global microhistory before it was cool and before it had a name. But that's absolutely how I think you should do global history. That's how historians of science, particularly in the Anglo-American tradition, were already doing history of science as microhistory.
Yes.
And the argument is simply that it's possible to do those local microhistories, but as global ones, that are either about individual objects moving, individual people moving, or even people that don't move, like Isaac Newton, who doesn't move very much at all,
No.
but is sitting at the heart of a web of connections.
Yeah. Using it very well indeed.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah. Okay. I don't think this idea of mine is anything original or new, but what I would like to say, the heart of Eurocentrism lies at the heart of Eurocentrism is actually imperial politics.
Yeah.
So the concept of empire creates a certain dominance, not necessarily a geographical and political, but also a cultural dominance as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So Eurocentric attitude is a tool for that, vehicle for that kind of attitude. So, and major scientific projects were part of that in Europe and elsewhere. Would you agree with this, and can you give more examples, or examples to illustrate this if you agree?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that empire, in lots of different forms, was a core driver and shaper of modern science over the last 500 years. And as you say, that idea in itself is not new. That's something that has been talked about since, the beginning of the end of empire, if not before. And certainly was very prominent in the sort of post-colonial science studies literature that was coming out in the very late 70s, but particularly the 80s and 90s. So I think that's, in a way, unsurprising. I think the important aspect now is to break down different types of imperialism, because empire wasn't just one thing.
No.
There were lots of different kinds of empires, and even within something like the British Empire, there's a big difference between, say, what the British Empire is doing in South Asia with a territorial control versus the way in which there are informal forms of empire in East Asia and China, right? So part of what my book does actually is to try and examine that in more detail so I begin with the Spanish colonization of the Americas, precisely because I agree with you, because I think that colonization has a really important role to play in explaining the making of modern science, but explaining that epistemic violence as well.
Yes.
So I examine how the Spanish both burnt lots of native Mexica Aztec books, how they suppressed indigenous religion, at the same time as constantly relying on indigenous people, the Mexica, the Aztecs, for knowledge about the Americas, for the geography, for the natural history. So I give the example of an Aztec physician called Martin de la Cruz, who wrote this beautiful illustrated book about Aztec medicine in the Aztec language of Nahuatl. And then that was translated into Latin, and then that Latin translation found its way into kind of European botany. So this is this story of both appropriation, but the movement of indigenous knowledge. But then we can fast forward much later to something like, well, not so much later, so we look at Newton. Newton, we talked about earlier, the classic example, often thought of as an isolated genius, sitting there, an apple falls on his head and he thinks, gravity. But as is clear, actually Newton was someone sitting for most of his life in Cambridge and London, almost his entire life in fact. He never left the UK, but he was collecting information from around the world. Partly because as Master of the Mint in London, he had access to and actually investments in all kinds of colonial companies, like the East India Company. So he was getting information of astronomical observations that East India Company officers had made in the Bay of Bengal and the Gulf of Tonkin off Vietnam. And similarly, he personally was invested in the transatlantic slave trade. So he invested in the South Sea Company, which was an English company that had a monopoly on slave trades to Spanish America at the time. Famously, there was an enormous bubble and then it went bust, but that's slightly a moot point because whether or not Newton made or lost any money, he invested his money in the trade in enslaved people. Okay, so did lots of other 18th century English gentlemen, but also Newton got information from astronomical and pendulum experiments made by people who were travelling aboard slave ships. So he got pendulum measurements made by French astronomers travelling on French slave ships off the coast of West Africa and in the French Caribbean. He got observations from slave owners, British slave owners in the Americas. And this was all crucial because, as you particularly know, Newton's theory of gravitation was extremely controversial when it was proposed. And more so on the continent, but also in the UK as well. Yeah. And he needed to collect all this data from around the world to show that his theory matched observations. So Newton is one of the best examples, I guess, of how a individual we associate so strongly with what it is to be modern and scientific, life, but also their very work was wrapped up with the project of, in this case, transatlantic slavery and colonial trade in Asia. And it's not a stretch to say that without those connections, Newton couldn't have, he couldn't have written the Principia, he couldn't have provided the evidence for it, whether or not he could have come up with the laws anyway. Yeah. But it would be very hard to, because he's constantly referring to these observations that he himself could not make.
Yeah. Also, being the head of the mint, he actually, his salary came from the empire.
Exactly.
So, he was,
and you see that later, I think, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, there are all kinds of ways in which British colonial scientists are being paid by the empire whilst doing science in the empire for the empire. So those kind of connections run throughout the book.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. So you know, both of us doing history of science professionally, but also we have this invested interest in making it accessible.
Yeah.
So I have engaged in writing at a popular level for the last 2-3 years, and I feel like there's a balance to strike, which is I'm kind of suffering from. You know, I have to get that balance between presenting new research and new approaches and having an accessible language for everybody. So there's constantly a balancing act going on with me. Would you agree? And how do you go about striking this balance, James?
So once again, I do agree with you that maybe first off, why I think it's so important to address general public and a broader sphere than just the academic ivory tower.
Bubble, yeah.
Bubble, yeah. And that's particularly the case in the history of science, because as we know now more than ever, science is such a big part of life, of everyone's lives. And it has a lot of cultural cachet as well. People from all around the world want to study science, different states want to invest in science. And I think why that's important is going to be different from where you are in the world, right? Writing for in Britain, a lot of that's got to do with, I think there's this inaccurate Eurocentric model of the history of science that actually percolates culture. It's in primary and secondary education in subtle ways. In our national curriculum, there's no history of science, but our science curriculum has moments where it introduces famous white guys.
Yes.
So you get your mention of Isaac Newton, you get your mention of Ernst Rutherford discovering the structure of the atom. And none of this more contested colonial history is part of it, but also the history is not diverse in terms of background, gender, etc.
Yeah.
And so part of why, and that feeds through to wider culture. You listen to radio programs, you watch the television. There's lots of science programming, there's quite a lot of interest in it. But there's just hundreds and hundreds of radio shows about Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. And the point of my book isn't that those people aren't important, they all feature in the book. Newton, Einstein, Darwin are all in there. But my point is they're not the only ones. And in fact, the French title of the book, the French publisher decided to change it to Copernicus and Newton were not the only ones.
What's the title?
Yeah. And that is another argument of the book, that they matter, but they're not the only ones. And that's clearly important for addressing diversity in science today, who is held up as a model for doing science today, who is seen as excellent or potentially excellent. Lots of these, both for internally for individuals, but externally for how people are assessed, are shaped by our public narratives of the history of science. So if I can do my little bit to change that, and lots of the rest of us can all work together to change that, I think that will make science itself better.
Yeah.
More fair, more equitable, both
inclusive
both within our own nations, but also internationally as well.
True.
Because there's massive power imbalances between the global north, the global south, the west and the east, etc., that I think are unhelpful, that a better history of science could address. And so the final line of my book is slightly cheesy, but also I really believe it, is that the future of science depends on a better understanding of its global past. And that is the argument.
Yeah.
In terms of the balance,
how do you do it?
yeah, how do you do it? I mean, some of it is just practical. So there is general readers don't really like theory, actually.
No.
But they do care, they're willing and care about the detail of the past and human experience. So, and that's convenient for me because I like that as well. I think it matters seriously historically as a cultural historian. So all those stories I'm telling you about, Topaya, a Polynesian navigator on the deck of HMS Endeavour singing to the stars, kind of bringing that world alive, serves a serious historical purpose, but it does also serve to capture the imagination of the general public. There's a slight subtle thing, and I call it kind of like secret historiography or stealth theory,
Go on.
where at the start of the book, I don't name theorists, but you can tell the general public something like, there was this old narrative, and people believe this silly old narrative because of empire, and I'm going to tell you this new narrative. So you've slightly kind of smoothed over the high theory and the name, you know, you're not mentioning Spivak by name, but actually you're telling them the basic historiographical point, which is there was this way of thinking about the past, and that's because of these historical and political circumstances to do with empire and its end. And now there's this new way of thinking about the past I want to introduce you to, which might be a better way to think about it in the current world. So that is historiography, it's just, you don't say, here's the historiography, because then that'll terrify you. So I thought a lot about how to do that, because often people say, oh, well, I can't do any historiography in my popular book. But I think you can. You just have to do it in this sort of subtle, stealth way, where they don't realise, the publisher doesn't realise, the reader doesn't realise, but actually it's historiography. It's the same with teaching, actually, as well. Students, I find, tend to hate the idea of historiography if you tell them it's historiography time. But if you actually get them discussing, you know, different views of the past and why it matters and who's arguing about it and why,
then they join in, don't they? Yeah, that really makes sense. But do you, obviously you believe in public engagement. For me, public engagement, doing what I do on a popular level, I think for me is activism of some sort. And I call it intellectual activism. What are your ideas about this? Obviously, you know, you have a mission, you know? So what is your mission? I mean, do you actually feel yourself as an activist as well?
Yeah, I love this term, actually, when we had to talk about this before, intellectual activism. And of course, many people historically felt like that. That's what post-colonial studies, post-colonial science studies was all about. That's what feminist science studies was all about. Lots of the best scholarship is grounded in not a antiquarian interest in the past. I say to people, actually, I don't know loads of history, and I'm not super interested in loads of history. I'm interested in the bits, and I know about the bits that I think really matter, the things I care about today. Personally, that's to do with the legacies of empire and how those structure the present. So again, in the British context, about how Britain's, in my view, failure to really reckon culturally, socially with the legacies of its imperial past has led to all kinds of inequities and inequalities today, both within Britain and Britain's relationship to the world. And particularly around racial equality and anti-racism. So you mentioned my first book was actually a history of racial science.
It was,
and that's because that drives a lot of what I care about and teach about, thinking about how ideas of race have been perpetuated through the sciences, and that even comes up in the book when I talk about genetics, and the history of genetics, and eugenics, and ideas about race, and structuring a lot of that around the world. So, yeah, I do think of myself, now you've used that term, as an intellectual activist. I suppose the next important part of activism is you can't do it alone, which is partly why I'm here, and it's been nice to talk to you and talk to other historians of science, and historians generally. But I still think that the history of science as a discipline is still massively weighted. Contributing on an equitable frame is, I think, the next really important task. And that's what a lot of people mean, at least in Britain, when they talk about decolonising.
That's right.
That's about not just doing the kind of work I'm doing and writing a book, but involving and foregrounding scholars and ideas and practices and sources from the former colonial world to a greater degree as well. And that's work that is only really just beginning and is ongoing. I think a lot more needs to be done.
Are you a decolonizer?
Yeah, I am, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, again, a bit like epistemic violence. I don't let that term structure my existence, and I don't see that as an end in itself. And I certainly don't think it's particularly useful to argue about what it may or may not mean. But at its core, yeah, I think the current world is structured by the failure to deal with the end of empire. Because the modern world was made by empires, then they collapsed in the mid-20th century, but now we're living in the aftermath of that. But by and large, most particularly large European empires didn't really want to think about that after they ended. They wanted to have a clean break with the past. Yeah. But the problem was there wasn't a clean break because the people, the cultures, the ideas, the economies had been exchanging for 500 years. Yeah. So in that sense, I think the core political project of the present is to decolonise. But I don't spend my days arguing about what that means or worrying about it or worrying about what that, the kind of, I think it gets taken up a lot. In Britain, it's a kind of loaded term in the media.
It is a bit, yeah.
So I have no interest. I think it sells newspapers, and I have no interest in selling newspapers.
No. Okay, so my last question is what's happening next with you?
So I guess a few things. Academically, I'm beginning writing a new book on the global history of the scientific revolution. Just a small task, which is going to take some of the earlier portions of Horizons, the book I've just written, but go into a lot more depth and be grounded in primary sources a lot more, looking at the history of the scientific revolution not as a quick, rapid, unidirectional change that happened just in Europe, but as a very long, drawn-out process of different cultures re-engaging with their pasts. So rather than thinking of the scientific revolution as a leap to modernity, I think of the scientific revolution in its early modern sense, and a revolution means a return. It's like a renaissance, a rebirth. A revolution means to go round in a circle. And you see parallel concepts in the Mahika Empire, in China, in the Mughal Empire, in the Ottoman Empire. And so whilst they don't all produce something that now we call modern science, like Newton, they are all at the same time re-engaging with their own pasts, often through connections to other cultures. And that's what I call a scientific revolution. So I'm trying to fundamentally rethink that at an intellectual level. On the public engagement side, I'm trying to do a lot more with schools. So I mentioned education. I've got some projects next year where I'm working with schools in Leeds, in Britain, and I've been working with some schools in London. We have a Black History Month in the UK around Black British history. Trying to work with teachers, with students and schools to produce material for the curriculum that they can easily use to teach some of the stuff that's in Horizons. Because not every teacher's going to read it, clearly not every 12-year-old can or will read it. But if there can be a couple of slides that a teacher could use to say, hey, you've learned about Rutherford and the atom, but here's Hantaro Nagoka, a Japanese physicist as well. Or you've learned about Francis Crick and James Watson for DNA. Well, here's Veronica Rodriguez, a Indian-Kenyan pioneer of neurogenetics. It's just those kind of things, so these stories can be introduced to children, particularly at school. So yeah, that's my plan, is to keep getting this out there. And the third bit is to work more with scholars from around the world. So that's one of the, again, reasons I'm delighted to be here. I have a few academic contacts around the world that think more about decentering the tradition, decentering the discipline, not just from the Anglo-American world, but thinking about what other traditions actually in the history of science. Because as we were talking about earlier, for instance, in Turkey, it's a really long established tradition, the history of science.
Yeah.
These departments, some of them have been going on a long time.
Yeah.
And how we can speak to one another more rather than developing in separate silos where there's the history of philosophy and science at Cambridge, there's the Harvard history of science, and they kind of talk to each other a lot.
Yes.
But there are lots of other people doing the history of science as well.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's my plan going forward.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope this will lead to other collaborations between us.
Yes.
Us meaning the general history of science community and you. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening.
Yes. Okay. Do we have a microphone? Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Meltem Hocam, hello.
Just a minor one.
Mikrofonu
hear me?
tutar mısın? Can you hear?
Just about, but
Wait. I'm holding your
yeah.
Yeah, the signature.
Yani aldım bu arada. Biraz uzun süre açılması isterseniz.
Okay.
It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. This is my question. What is the difference between writing a book titled A Global History of Science and writing a history of global science? I mean, do you think science by nature is a global thing, or once they said a universal thing? Because using the same example,
We can also prove the thesis that science by nature is an international thing. Because Chinese, Ottoman, Arabic, Europeans, everyone in one way or another in some part of the history contributed to this universal enterprise. And what is the difference between this and your thesis?
Wonderful question, thank you. This is where it gets a little bit more methodological than I put in the book, right? So, historians of science usually would say something like, well, everyone thinks science is universal, but it turns out it's made in a local setting, so there's sort of limit to the universality of science. What I think is that science is universal, but it had to be made so through these global connections. And so the real title of the book should be A Global History of Global Science, because it's both those things together. Obviously that's not very catchy, so I didn't go for that. My serious, slightly more theoretical view is that the global is both an analytic category and an actors category, or what's sometimes called an emic category and an etic category. So we can study things globally from our perspective as historians, so it's a global history of science, tracing all these connections that made science around the world. But also we can look at, well, what did global or universal mean to people in the past? And it didn't mean the same thing in the pre-modern period, in the medieval period. It didn't mean the same thing in the early modern period. The history, I think, of modernity maybe generally, but certainly the history of modern science is exactly how we went from having quite different ideas about what science is, what the limits of the world are, what is the world, what's universal, to how a series of global connections produced this modern idea of the global, the universal, such that now we think we're all doing the same thing. And we kind of are to an extent, in that you might be a Chinese scientist in Beijing, or a South Asian scientist in Bangalore, or a British scientist in Cambridge, but it's all science, and the laws you find or the results you find are supposed to hold true everywhere. But that itself that is the end point of the history I tell. And the classic example of that is Newton, because Newton now we think of as, oh, well, he had these universal laws, they worked everywhere. And that was his thesis, but the problem was that nobody thought that was true right at the time, and had to be convinced that the same law of nature applied to an atom and the Earth, and that it applied the same whether or not you were in Paris or West Africa, particularly because it didn't look like it did, because gravity varies across the surface of the Earth. So this production of global science through global connections is the story I tell, and it's why I'm particularly delighted you asked that question, because that's the real kind of core intellectual point that drives me, but it's often not of major interest to people because it's kind of like a slightly niche theoretical thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Hoca?
Nice to have you here. Thank you for coming. Maybe it's too early to ask this question, but you know, British Empire is still there.
Yeah.
What do you think about the impact of Brexit on British science?
Yeah, I got asked this earlier by someone. It is hard to tell, actually, because I think it's more complicated than many scientists in Britain would like to think. So when Brexit was announced, or when it was happening, it was sort of, okay, it's going to be a disaster for science. And it was certainly a disaster for some institutions and individuals, for sure. I have very good friends who are colleagues in the sciences, German particularly, who just went and got a job in Germany. So there's definitely a loss of excellent scientists in Britain, and I think that's more at the level, actually, less structurally to do with funding and more culturally to do with feeling welcome. It wasn't that they lost their jobs, or some of them lost funding, but lots of them could have stayed, but they sort of thought, well, screw this, why would I want to stay in a country that's so kind of set on this particular path? In more concrete terms, there's the potential loss of European funding for big projects, although even that is still being slightly papered over. And the reality is that for the sciences, lots of the connections are international beyond Europe. And in terms of the finances that people worry about, it's from student fees, which are mainly international beyond Europe. So you said, like, is it too soon to tell? I think it is for a serious reason, in that in terms of the basic structure and finances of science in Britain, there's not going to be a problem in the short or even medium term. In terms of the culture of science, I think it does work against some of the things that I care about, in terms of a more equitable international relationship between different worlds of science. Obviously, this is a fracturing within Europe, so it's slightly different as well. But I do think it works against that, and there's a sort of separate history of how histories of individual nations in Europe, their science is written as connected or disconnected. So even, I'm talking about all this kind of global stuff. Actually, there's not really good histories of European science that properly integrate British, French, German, Spanish, Italian science as some kind of cohesive story either. Particularly more in the modern setting when these nations are being formed. You get a bit more of that clearly in the early modern. But even then, Britain is sort of an outlier. Thank you for a wonderful question.
Any other questions? Have you seen?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for not being able to join earlier. I'm late, so I missed most of the debate, so I hope it's not off topic. But how do you see the relationship between science, power, and money? Because as far as I see, science serves states and corporations, and they are the ones who are funding science. So can we expect good results to come out of something like this? Is there, for example, meta-analysis of who is funding science and what for?
Yeah, fantastic question. And yeah, the short, so the reason I'm finding it hard to answer is because the short answer is I agree with you, and this is where I feel a bit more pessimistic. Because again, my story isn't a happy story of globalization, and I tell this sort of early modern history of empire, but then the last 3 chapters of the book are the 20th and 21st century, and that is the history, and in fact, the second half, so part 3 of the book is called Capitalism, Industry, I can't remember what it's about capitalism. And part 3 is about states. So it is about business, states, capitalism as being the world in which 19th and 20th century science is built. And you're right, that's not a pretty story either. That's about how war, particularly as well, so in the case of states in the 19th century, was driving, for instance, Mendeleev, the famous Russian, chemistry, periodic table. A lot of his work was actually aimed at supporting the Tsarist wars, developing gunpowder, exploiting oil in the Caucasus. So there is this very tight link between industry and war and the states and science in the 19th and 20th century, as you're suggesting. And I do think at the minute we have, as it sounds like you're suggesting, a kind of pretty strong version of that, right? In which we have very powerful states, like the United States and China. We have very powerful and rich corporations, often in the US and China, and that's structuring a lot of the science that's being funded, the science that's being done, the training of students. How to, if you think that's a problem, how to address that is more difficult because it's a structural thing. I guess this is where being a cultural historian is less helpful. But I do think that certain kinds of change do come from below, even with these kind of financial power structures. So my hope is that a history of science in the public sphere, including the education of science students, that presents a more equitable view, but also invites us to be critical thinkers about the production of science. You obviously already are, lots of people are, that makes that kind of thing accessible, that critical thinking about the sciences, would help nudge things in the right direction, or I don't know if this is a book people are aware of in Turkey, but The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Sin. It's a book by an anthropologist, and the subtitle is Collaborative Survival in the Ruins of Capitalism. And so it's about that actually we can't probably change the enormous power structures that are in our way in terms of capitalism, globalization, even climate change, but we can work together to make the most of it in a shitty circumstance. And so that's what I see as, that's my kind of take on how, in the context of science and history, we should be working. Yeah, we probably can't make everything better, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Any other question? Yes, Majan.
I have your book. I read part of your book, and as the title indicates, it's a global des sciences. They use it in plural,
Yeah.
you know. If you think about writing a book on the global history of a specific science, not the whole sciences, how could it look like? I was just thinking about it.
Yeah, another wonderful question. So, on the difference between science and sciences, first, and then I'll answer. The book is a global history of the sciences, and in fact, the sciences in the book are conceived incredibly broadly, in that it incorporates indigenous knowledge, Sanskrit texts on, like the Vedic texts on botany. So I don't have a really set vision of what science is. I'm quite liberal with what might counter science. And actually, I think in English, people have got a bit hung up about, is it science or is it sciences? I thought about this just in terms of the technical semantics of English. I don't think the single excludes the plural, actually, as it happens. I think that's just a point like philosophers made to sound clever. So I don't think that's a big problem. Have I thought about writing, but your question about like, would it be better or is it useful maybe to drill down onto a particular science to flesh this out, you know, like a global history of chemistry or physics, or even something more specific, like a global history of, I'm trying to think of a science that lasts a long time, natural history maybe, or evolution. In a way, like, the book does mini versions of that, right? Particularly later on, it becomes organised a bit more around disciplines, as disciplines emerge in the 19th and 20th century. So there's a chapter on essentially the global history of the new physics of the 20th century, a global history of genetics. So there's mini versions of that for exactly the reason you suggest, but it's quite helpful to drill down onto a particular science, because often there are very particular links. So genetics, I argue, was all about state building. That's why genetics became such a big thing in the mid-20th century, because there were lots of states that were either new or that existed but were rebuilding, and genetics became a tool of state building. So it allows that level of specificity. Would I write a whole book about science? I did. So my first book was, it's pseudoscience, but that's where I was testing out a lot of these ideas. Because it was about phrenology, this science of the skull and head. So I could have chosen, there were reasons I chose phrenology. I could have chosen like a more respectable science, but as it happens I chose phrenology, but the point actually was exactly the one that you suggest, that it was useful to say, okay, here's one science that's pretty clearly demarcated, because it's got a specific name, it emerges at a specific point and then it gets discredited. What would it look like to try and write the history of that one science, but not be confined to a particular nation or an area or even an empire? So in that book I talk a lot about, well, this could just be a history of the British Empire in phrenology, but I track the connections between French, British and American phrenologists to show that actually even the bounds of a single European empire are broken up, and that those connections matter, as it turns out. So this is a long way of saying I agree with you.
Any other connect?
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Coming to Istanbul, I really liked it.
Absolutely.
I have a couple of questions. My first one is, how much do you think history of science is different than the good old-fashioned history of ideas?
Great question. And there's a parallel one that I think is getting at the same thing, that I'm often asked, is this different from the history of knowledge? In fact, you had these right
Yeah,
before.
it is,
So
yeah.
history of knowledge versus history of science or history of ideas. I think I've probably revealed how I think about theory, and I think theory is useful when it's useful, but not something to argue about. So the history of, saying the history of science is just a way to signal a few things. It's a way to signal this is going to be about knowledge generally. It's going to be about the things that you think of as science today, but also some things that aren't. It's not going to be a history of religious ideas or political philosophy, which might be part of the history of ideas, right? Even though those matter to the history of science. So it's partly that. It's partly the content it signals, or something a little bit more specific. And then it's partly the method. I think that's probably the thing that actually it more signals, in particularly the sort of Anglo-American discipline of the history of science that developed quite separately, self-consciously, even in different departments from the history of ideas. Famously, in fact, at Cambridge, where you have sort of Quentin Skinner, history of ideas, history of political thoughts, more, and then you have a separate history of science department, and they're both writing about people like Thomas Hobbes, but without talking to one another. And the history of science was much more, as it developed originally, about situating the ideas in the social, political, cultural and material context in a way that when you say the history of ideas in Britain, I'm usually thinking at best the linguistic or intellectual context, and at worst, no context. So that's the difference. You have another question?
If it is not.
Why not? Yeah, I like your question, so.
So there's also a criticism about this new global history of science,
Yeah.
and also even post-colonial studies of how they recreate these old hierarchies in a different way. As historians of science in Turkey, for example, we rarely scrap and find our own vestiges of science in our past. Now we have to compete with this new discourse. And we are constantly on the position to catch up. And we really don't know how to get in a dialogue with the advanced methodologies produced still in the global north. So my question would be basically, if you, or have you come across similar, questions or objections in different parts of the world when you are, giving talks and conferences, and how would you compare that basically, put it, in a larger global scale of these criticisms or objections?
So yeah, it's interesting because you raise the criticism that's more interesting than the one I usually get. So there's a kind of intellectual criticism sometimes about whether it works or not, but then yours is more of a political or disciplinary criticism about the power imbalance in terms of historians of science in Britain and the United States versus historians of science elsewhere in the world. So far, just in terms of your really specific question, I haven't had a negative response in terms of people so far, including in the Global South, have been quite keen and open to this, partly because it does have that reparative element in that it actually is about introducing the stories that they know anyway to the wider world, and also to show how the key thing about the book is everyone's going to read it from a different perspective, right? So if you're Turkish and you're reading this book, well, it's the history of Turkish science way better than me, but it's going to situate that within the world. If you're in Bangladesh, you learn about Bengali scientists, which you already know about, but you're seeing Bengali science in the world. If you're in Britain, different thing. So people often are quite receptive to that. But those people, now I come to think of it, aren't always professional historians of science. They're often scientists that are really keen on that. So global historians have worried about this, more in terms of the sort of resources this requires. to do this kind of work as well. And actually that's something we worry about in Britain, partly because we don't have the resources sometimes, in that we're worried that you need to go to the US, do a PhD for 8 years at Harvard, and then get a professorship there, and then you can travel around the world, learn 30 languages, and write a global history. I go back to what I said earlier, I don't think that's what global history is. I think you can write global history from a location, from your vantage point, just like these scientific thinkers. So in the sense of the basic resources of sort of travel, of language, etc., I think it's perfectly possible to be a historian of Turkey or a historian of the Ottoman Empire, especially in fact, and think about global connections. Sometimes I think it's because that's not so novel for you guys, right, actually. So you say like the methodological advancement, actually a lot of this is novelty in Britain and the US, but if you're writing a history of Ottoman science, you are writing a kind of transnational history, right, anyway. In terms of actually departments of discipline collaborating more equitably, I do agree that that is more of an issue, in that what people in Britain and the United States are reading, who they're citing, who they're talking to, that is something which I think the Global North needs to do more of in order to fund the kind of intellectual exchange that you're describing isn't happening as much. And, well, not the funding, but the vice versa. So this is a long way of saying, I tell a story about global cultural exchange in science. What I would like there to be is a global cultural exchange in the history of science as well. And I've been involved in that in some small ways. Earlier, my PhD examiner, Sujit Sundaram at Cambridge and Simon Schaffer at Cambridge organised a series of workshops called Exploring Traditions in the History of Science. And unfortunately, I didn't involve Turkish historians of science, but it was South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And it was about exactly this, that we don't all do the same thing. We all do different things, and there's quite different national traditions of doing the history of science. But it would be really valuable not to all do the same thing, not so you have to do what I do, or I have to do what you do, but so we could talk more and have some kind of influence or exchange. So your thinking might be changed by what I do, and mine might be changed by what I do, but it doesn't mean we become the same person. I'm not asking everyone to write a global history of science, nor would I expect everyone would want to. So that's my kind of thinking. But I'm still thinking through these things, as you can tell. A great question.
Any other question? Well, thank you very much for coming today and listening to the conversation that we had with James. Thank you very much. James, we have something for you. Okay. Oh, sorry. This is the production, one of the productions of the Civilization Studies Center. So this is for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
America. Oh yeah, we were talking about it.
You were talking, just now, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you all for coming as well. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you. I'll give you the bag.
not really.